Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Fiscal Fridays. We're trying something a little different this week by bringing in our Senior Policy Fellow, Ron Nate. In his spare time, Ron is an economics professor at BYU, Idaho, and he's previously served on the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee for 2 years. Today, we're hoping to talk to him about how the federal government's influence in Idaho's budget continues to grow year after year. With these federal funds continuing to grow in the Idaho state budget, nearly half of all the money that we're spending this year will come from federal funds. This increases the influence of Washington, D.C. and the Biden White House on Idaho policy. We'll dig into these issues this time on Fiscal Fridays. Well, Ron, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the governor's budget this year, his recommendation is for $5.8 billion in federal funding to be spent in fiscal year 2024. Now, this is 43% of the whole budget. Only a couple years ago, it was $3.7 billion and 38% of the budget, and which is still a lot.
Yeah.
But it's grown substantially in just 2 years. Now, Governor Little is really proud of saying that he has a balanced budget and that Idaho is fiscally upright. Is this really what a balanced budget looks like?
That's a great question. It can't be called a balanced budget when nearly half of it is being funded by borrowed money from the federal government. We know the federal government's over $31 trillion in debt. Yeah. It's just astounding numbers. One of my econ professors used to call it a mego number, M-E-G-O, as in my eyes glaze over, because you can't even comprehend what it means. But 43% of our state budget funded by the federal government. It used to be 38%. When I first went into office in 2015, it was 35%. So it keeps going up and up. Two problems with that is what happens when most of our budget is done by the federal government. We're no longer a sovereign state. And the second part of it is that every federal dollar comes with federal rules. And we saw it not too long ago. Just last year, as a matter of fact, our legislature, despite my no vote, voted for school lunch funding to continue on through the summer. And, you vote against it because, first of all, it's really not a proper role of government to feed kids throughout the summer. That's the role of the family.
Absolutely.
And number two, that money, we soon found out, came with strings attached, that if your schools were going to take this money, they needed to provide for accommodations for all types of kids, and it was based on transgender and whatnot. So it came with an accommodation requirement. So therefore, taking the money meant that you no longer had control over your own school's policy. And so very problematic on a lot of grounds, the spending, the control, and the federal government. We just can't justify that.
Agreed. And those funding, that funding, I remember that last year when we were rating bills on the spending index, and that was going to be $17 million in funding from the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. Mm-hmm. And now this year we're seeing the fallout of all of these schools with these transgender bathroom policies that allow the guys to use the girls' room and vice versa. And so it's really becoming a problem, because then these schools look at this money and they go, okay, well, we either capitulate to the federal government or we lose all this money that we promised everybody we'd be able to provide. And so it breaks down the system and it ruins the sovereignty of our state.
Yeah, that last part where you have officials, whether at the local or the state level, starting to make decisions based on whether or not we're going to lose that funding is a dangerous situation to be in. It shows that you are no longer the master of your domain. You are being controlled by the federal interests. And early in my legislative career, I proposed a bill to end Common Core. And I thought that, I'll be interested to see where my legislative colleagues fall on this. We'll have a great debate about whether we should set our own education policy or if we should adopt a Common Core, which is kind of formed by a large consortium. But that wasn't even the debate. The first question I got asked is, if we drop Common Core, will we lose federal funding? I was floored by that. I was like, I didn't even know that was a question. So I went and looked it up, and sure enough, in our memorandum of understanding, that our acceptance of Common Core gave us access to money. And in fact, we found out Alaska was being threatened with its Title IX money if they dropped Common Core. And so that shows that the money comes with strings, and those strings may seem light at first, but they are heavy controls that weak legislators and weak government officials are not willing to abandon, because they want the dollar bill more than the freedom.
Exactly. And I'll actually steal a line from our colleague Fred Birnbaum, and he usually says that these aren't strings, they're nooses. And that's really the best way to describe it, because these local government agencies and the state government itself will end up hanging themselves on this federal funding. Now, moving on to the ARPA funds specifically. So these ARPA funds and funds from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, ironically called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill back in D.C., these were very expensive government programs. ARPA cost $1.9 trillion nationally, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act cost $1.2 trillion nationally. Now, Idaho for IIJA will receive like $2.5 billion. And for ARPA, Idaho received $1.9 billion. And these are huge federal funding injections. They're numbers, like you said, that are just so big you can't really comprehend just how big that number is. And so the argument for these funds, and the governor's made this argument, it's been made repeatedly on the floor, that if we don't spend these funds here in Idaho, they'll just go to other states like California. Is that true? Do we have to spend this funding?
Well, it's an interesting question. When they're borrowed funds and your state doesn't spend them or rejects them, does it mean the federal government borrows money just to let it sit there? Do they, as legislators argue on the floor, do they send them to California instead? No, they're allocated on a percentage basis. You notice that even though you cited over $3 billion coming into Idaho, $3 billion is just a tiny fraction of the entire federal ARPA and IIJA money. So we are small potatoes, and it doesn't get sent to other states. It means just our federal government borrows less. And even if it went to other states, let them take the nooses. We'll take our freedom. And so I would rather Idaho pays for Idaho programs, and that we don't end up begging the federal government for money and then taking their rules. One interesting piece of legislation would be that if we did income tax withholding and held it at the state level, and flipped the script, let the federal government beg the state for our tax dollars instead of us sending all our tax dollars in and then begging the federal government for the money back, or at least part of it back, I think that would change the power structure a bit. But right now we're in this situation where any federal dollars coming in, we feel like, we pay federal tax dollars, so we should be begging for it too. But it's, they hold us hostage with our own tax dollars. So we ought to be very careful about that.
Absolutely. And so another problem with this funding is that a lot of it has expiration dates. So ARPA is set to expire in 2026. The IIJA is set to expire in 2029. And a lot of these programs were actually used for ongoing projects rather than one-time spending. For instance, we just saw how JFAC approved, and now it's on the floor, this legislation that's supposed to continue these childcare infrastructure block grants. And those are funded by ARPA. But what they do is they were supposed to be used for one-time funds to expand the childcare infrastructure in the state of Idaho. But instead, they're being used for salaries. They're being used for basically a free and reduced price childcare system.
Sure.
And lawmakers were considering not funding it, because it's a socialist program. They're using one-time funds inappropriately for that program, and because we found out earlier this year, Senator Glenetta Zeiderveld found that these funds were being inappropriately used. They weren't being used for what the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee assigned them for. And so they were going to vote them down. They were going to not do that this year. And then the daycare industry came to the legislators and they said, well, we'll have to shut down, or we'll have to reduce seats, or we'll have to cut people, or name your problem. And it would have been, they were trying to argue it would be a catastrophe if they didn't get these funds, but if they're set to expire, what are we going to do?
Wow. So much to sift through there. First of all, using these ARPA and IIJA money for things that are not one-time expenditures, but ongoing. You mentioned salaries, and there are new positions being hired with this money. What happens when the money goes away? Then Idaho is left holding the bag. Number two, we're funding pre-K systems with them. And like you said, there was a violation of the law in how that money went. But nonetheless, the idea that we're going to expand a school system into daycare, into pre-K, a school system, by the way, which by a lot of measures has been failing. The reading scores, science scores, math scores have all been stagnant or going down no matter how much money we dump into it. And now we say, oh, well, let's just extend the education to earlier years, even though we can't perfect the K-12 right now. And when there's fraud involved too, the last thing we should do is fund more of the fraud. Until we get that straightened out and hold the people and the agencies accountable for their misdeeds in this, we shouldn't even consider another budget in that area, because why would we keep funding something that wasn't supposed to be funded to begin with? So there's a lot of problems with that, and they're all, I think, equally bad. Proper role of government, potential for fraud, and then ongoing expenses that we may not be able to sustain, all problematic in my view. Yep.
And so how does this impact the taxpayer going forward? So if this funding goes away, how will that affect Idahoans?
Reagan used to say there's nothing that approaches eternal life on earth so much as a government program. So once you start these programs, once you expand this spending, when the federal government goes away, if that federal dollar goes away, what do? We tend to raise taxes. And so it will affect Idahoans. There are costs to daycare, there's costs to pre-K, but if we have a state program for it, it's putting those costs on others. So it's creating another socialist program that Idaho will need to fund going forward.
That's terrifying. Well, Ron, thank you for coming on the show and explaining this complicated subject for us. And for you all, be sure to catch up on Ron's work, not only from the legislative session, but over the summertime. Also catch other episodes of Fiscal Fridays and research reports and bill analyses from Idaho Freedom Foundation by going to idahofreedom.org. See you next time.